Hey everybody, Bill here. When we recorded this episode, we ran into some technical difficulties, and while Amy and I could hear him over our headsets, Jordan's dialogue didn't record. We've gone through and edited the recording so that you don't have long spans of silence while Jordan is talking, but what that means is that you won't hear anything from Jordan this week, and there will be several cuts on the video where we edited out those silent breaks. There are one or two places where the conversation between Amy and me sounds a little disjointed because we're missing Jordan's contributions, but for the most part, it still flows together well. We apologize for the inconvenience, but we hope you still enjoy this week's show.
Welcome to the Sandersonian Institute of Cosmere Studies, where there's always another secret.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Sandersonian Institute of Cosmere Studies. We are on episode 3, April 16th, 2018, and this episode we will be discussing book 1 of Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn series, The Final Empire. Now, before we get started, there is a lot to talk about in this book, so there's a chance that this will end up being one of the books we end up discussing over the course of 2 episodes. We're just going to play it by ear, however that ends up going. As always, I am joined by my co-hosts, Jordan and Amy. Welcome.
Hello.
And of course, the show is directly supported by our listeners via Patreon. Visit our Patreon page at www.patreon.com/Cosmere Studies. Okay, so let's just dive right in. So with Mistborn, I'm guessing that I know, Jordan, this is the one that pulled you into the series as a whole. Is that right? And you've already talked about that I guess on the first episode. And then Amy, was yours first one Elantris, or?
I think it was. Yeah,
Okay.
It probably was.
Okay, so now this book is kind of cool because there are a lot of really cool things about it, how it was written and stuff like that. One of the first things that really stands out is the Mistborn trilogy as a whole was written in one long go. You know, a lot of times authors will write a book or a book, and then they'll write a sequel, and then they'll write another sequel, and it'll end up being a little bit disjointed, or it'll end up being spread over the course of several years. Pat Rothfuss. And but before Brandon even sold this book to Tor, or the series to Tor, he actually had all 3 books written. He just had to go through and revise a little bit. And so the whole trilogy works as a long, continuous story, but he plotted it out to the point where the first book stands alone by itself, but then the trilogy brings in an even larger story. And of course, we wouldn't be here if that larger story wasn't part of an even larger story. So. Well, and the thing is, this book, especially this one, it's kind of 2 stories layered over on top of each other, because we have the main story following Kelsier and Vin and the crew, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then we also have the epigrams. At the beginning of each chapter, there's a sentence or 2 or a paragraph explaining something that happened 1,000 years ago, and it talks about the rise of, like, how the Lord Ruler came to be the Lord Ruler.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just a really cool way, because I remember when I'm reading it, I would get to a new chapter and I'd immediately, like, usually when you finish a chapter and you think, okay, it's time to finish, you close the book and you walk away. I'd always read the epigram before I closed the book and I walked away, because it's just a nice little tidbit of story that you can use to close. So.
Oh yeah, the second time reading it through, I was like, oh yeah, that's the twist with it. And so it was interesting reading it this time, because I'm terrible at picking up on hints and stuff, especially rereading the books and making better notes to slow down and focus more has made me realize that, oh, that was a hint there. And that's another interesting thing that I'm catching little bits here and there, whereas before I was too interested, I just gotta go. And so I would just read really fast.
Mm-hmm.
So
I actually want to take just a second to look into that because one of the things that I learned as I was reading, a general question that people will often ask Brandon is, hey, what's your favorite book? And one of the answers he gives pretty consistently is Les Miserables. And it was really interesting as I was rereading this series, I noticed a lot of parallels because you have in the Vin and Kelsier relationship, you have a very similar relationship to Cosette and Jean Valjean, who was a former criminal who had decided to change his life and lead this and not lead this revolution, but work towards helping other people, and ended up becoming part of the schoolboys' rebellion in France. So today I was playing around. I ended up writing a parody of the Final Countdown called "The Final Empire," and it sort of became a people's rallying songs, much like the songs of angry men from Les Miserables. And I said, I have inadvertently created Les Miserables, and so because it's Mistborn.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, if you want to check that out, I actually have that posted on the Patreon page. It's available for everybody. So,
but that takes a lot of time in the book for her to develop, because you can see little hints there, here and there, where the crew is inviting her in and she's suspicious of everything at the beginning, and then gradually she starts letting more and more trust come in, because she's like, well, they haven't stabbed me in the back and it doesn't look like they're going to, and they don't do it to each other, and so it's just a whole change of mindset for her.
Well, and then, like you mentioned that Kelsier had this traumatic event, which is what led to him snapping and recognizing his abilities as a Mistborn. With Vin, there is no one moment because her whole life was just that awful.
Okay. Yeah, it was terrible.
So it just happened, and she started doing it, burning, what was it, zinc? Zinc in just
trace amounts, yeah.
In trace amounts, just because she had been traumatized her entire growing up. And so one look back actually at what you were talking about, Amy, is that leads to one of my absolute favorite scenes in the book. Which scene? The scene where Vin is sitting with the crew and they're all talking and just
that's right,
spending time jovially, and she looks at the door where she had stood when they first brought her into the crew. And she sees, sort of, not literally sees, but she pictures
kind of
herself.
Imagines herself there as a whole different kind of person. And so it's just like an image of what she had been, and now she's totally changed.
Exactly, just the former Vin. It's like, this is who she was. And she just sits back and she kind of marvels at the journey that she's taken over the course of this year. That's one thing that I've noticed is, apparently in the original Mistborn trilogy, each book takes place over the course of a year, and then there's about a year in between each book. So the whole series takes about 5 years or so. Just an interesting little tidbit that I noticed when Brandon was talking about it. Okay, so now let's take a step back again and look at the origins of the book. Now, Brandon, one of the things that he said is, again, Elantris was, I believe, the 7th book that he wrote, and he'd written, which means he'd written several others before he even got published. I believe among those 7, and possibly not the 7, it might be like 11 or something, I don't know, but were 2 books that he'd written. There was one book he refers to as Mistborn Prime, and there was another book he refers to as The Final Empire Prime. Now, if you notice, those 2 titles are a little familiar because now we're talking about Mistborn, The Final Empire. And yeah, so he kind of cannibalized 2 stories together, changed a few things around. I believe Vin was originally a boy in one of those. I can't remember which one Vin was in. Mistborn Prime. And just, so he changed a lot of things. He combined things. And sometimes he'll have what he calls a failed book, but he'll put little things that he likes from it aside, and then he'll pull them into other books that he later writes. And that's how we get Mistborn, which is pretty amazing. Well, and when he describes the red sun, I immediately think of Krypton because, Superman. But
I've always been more of a Batman fan. Oh.
I like both. They have a fun little buddy story going on. Anyway, well, and that's the other origin of Mistborn is, Brandon has a lot of ideas. He likes taking tropes and then turning them on their heads and making them his. And he did that with two different tropes for this book intentionally. The first one is he wanted to write a heist story like Ocean's 11. And so he liked the idea of having a lot of highly competent specialists working together to accomplish
one goal,
an impossible goal. And then the other one was he wanted to play with the trope of, when you look at fantasy, one of the most popular tropes to use is you have the prophesied hero who goes out and he fights the evil overlord. Brandon thought, well, what if the prophesied hero went to fight the evil, the great evil, and lost? And then 1,000 years pass, and here we are. So he creates this. It doesn't fit the exact genre, but essentially Mistborn is a dystopian story. You have this horrible world where everything's bad and people work together to fix things. And then he took those two stories and he put them together, and here we go. And so now with a heist story, okay, so we've got Ocean's 11. Who are Kelsier's 11? We've got the crew. Okay, so let's take a look at each of these characters, just sort of dive into them a little bit. So Kelsier, of course, is our leader.
Our noble.
He's the one. Everybody knows Kelsier. And then Vin is his young apprentice.
And I think she works a lot better as a girl, because otherwise it'd be very boy heavy.
So yeah. Vin, his choice to change the Vin character into a girl really adds to the story and makes it work a lot more. Because without Vin, I think she's like the only female on the crew. She's the only main.
They wouldn't work for a guy, because the guy has to be the one that has to go and everything. And if you're low level, then you're not going to be approached.
It allows her to sit and observe, and so. Well, and they didn't have that same, the same sort of gender stigmas. In this society, there are very specific male-female gender roles. Sometimes Brandon likes to emphasize that, other times he likes to de-emphasize it. But in this one, it's very clearly set in those boundaries. This is the male role. This is a masculine role.
I love all the stuff with the handkerchief and how Vin's like, what am I supposed to do with this? She's like, what does this mean?
Poor Spook.
Spook is so adorable.
He just had a crush on the girl, okay?
Oh, yeah, I don't blame him. I was just like,
I love
Spook, I want to cuddle you. You poor little thing. But
I have been Spook in that situation.
I've had to let down Spook, and I felt bad about that.
It made her transition from the ska world to the noble world more stark. Because she was going from this very hard area to, again, in the noble circles in that culture, it was very soft and delicate, and Vin needed to be softened. Like she had hardened herself in defense, and anybody who was in that environment would put up barriers that just could not be surpassed. And being in an environment where she could trust people with the crew, and being in an environment where the world wasn't as harsh, and although it was still scary in other ways.
Yeah, she could relax. She could eat enough food. Yeah, and it's interesting. I'm guessing you guys have no more address, but it really does. No, but it really does change how you move in some regards. And there are certain things that you have to make sure that you don't do, and you do. And I remember being like a teenager and finding out, okay, don't cross your legs this way, otherwise you're going to flash everybody. And just little etiquette things that you kind of have put in your head, and that you're sitting there going, oh, well, I lifted my long skirt to go upstairs and different stuff like that. That's very different, that you have to learn how to do, and it's just a huge difference that way too. The random tidbit is I actually had to buy my daughter this book called Princesses Wear Pants, because she went on such a huge thing where she's like, I want to be princess. I want to be pretty. I have to wear dresses. And I'm like, it's 30 degrees outside. You're not wearing a dress. And so I had to boil it down to, you can be pretty in other clothes too for her. And so it was just kind of interesting in how dresses and being pretty make such a big difference. And Vin wasn't concerned about that for so long, and then she likes being pretty and she takes it as a mask.
Yeah, exactly. And she starts wondering, okay, what's actually the mask? Who am I completely underneath? They do talk about how, Vin, even at the very beginning, she's very graceful, but at the beginning it's the grace of a predator.
Oh yeah,
not this this girl
pretty
of the
delicate
court.
Just like everywhere else.
But she has the grace, and so they just sort of need to point it in the right direction so that she can use it.
I did like
towards their ends.
Yeah, when she first dances, they're like, you haven't danced before? You've only been dancing for a week? And she's like, yeah, is this hard? I think it is commented sort of, or it's like I noticed that she's always perched on the chairs. She doesn't like to sit.
When she's reading the logbook, especially, like she takes it and she curls up in the chair. Yeah.
Take it as small as possible. Yeah, and she's ready to go at a moment. So it's almost like a predator and prey in a sense, so that she can, like, I remember I thought there was some mention of her always making sure to know where the exits are in an escape route too.
On that note, have both of y'all read The 11th Metal?
I may have, but I don't remember.
The 11th Metal is a short story. It was included as part of the Mistborn RPG. It was written for the RPG, and then it was included in the Scadrial based stories. But one of the things that it mentions, it sort of stands out. Kelsier actually was drawn to the emotional metals at first. Anytime Gimel, his trainer, would say, okay, how would you get through this situation? He instinctively said, okay, I would soothe this person and explain this. And he would put himself in situations where he could talk his way in, and he basically saw the emotional metals as a way to enhance that inherent charisma that he's got. And, Gimel said, you're more than that. You have all these other powers. And so Gimel sort of pushed him to study the
more physical ones,
the physical steel and iron, especially. And eventually Kelsier became an absolute master of that.
He was crazy good.
Well, while we're talking about Vin's training, I love the fact, again, this is part of the whole concept of a bunch of specialists, of highly competent specialists. And I can't remember whose idea it was, but Kelsier, at first he just sort of does it, I think, to kind of ship her off to somebody. And he has part of it is because, Kelsier had a million other things that he had to be doing because he's Kelsier. And so he has her study a little bit of emotional allomancy with Breeze. And then she's, and at first she's upset. She thinks, oh, he's shipping me off to be babysat. And then she realizes how much she's learning from Breeze, and she says, hey, can the other people train me?
Yeah, I recently just skimmed the scene with Marsh, and that was really nice that he's like, oh, you're already thinking like that at the very beginning, because she totally dismisses his metal, and then he's like, no, and he gives her a little hit more, and she's like, oh, and she like starts to clue in, because I think it's because she's such a listener, like you guys have been saying, compared to Kelsier, who's like, I go and I do and I talk, and I just talk and talk and talk, whereas she sits and analyzes things a little bit more, because that's how she's gotten through her whole life.
And that's one of the things I love about Brandon's writing, is he's willing to explore these things beyond a surface level. He says, he creates a magic system, and then he thinks, okay, what does this mean? Where is this useful? How can this be used outside of just, because these people have been studying allomancy for a long time. What might they have figured out that other people wouldn't even realize? And so she ends up working with basically all of the crew, learning and becoming a master in all of these allomantic metals. Oh, yeah. And you get some of the most interesting scenes from that, I think, because you see into each of the characters a little bit more, and you learn about Vin a bit more, and there's just some really, really cool development that happens in each of those.
And you actually learn about Marsh, because Marsh isn't there very often.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is Marsh can tell.
Oh, yeah.
Except for when she's using the copper cloud, of course. But Marsh still knows, because
it's Marsh.
She's been around Allamasters forever, and so... Like, you get a look into Ham, you get a look into Breeze. One of my favorites is, she even has some chats with Doxson.
And especially after she she's upset about Elend, I think, and how everybody's like so instantly anti-noble. And she's like, well, and she finds out Dachshund was on a plantation. And so she's like, so what was it like? Because she never got that experience, and she's horrified by his backstory.
Right.
But I mean, he's just kind of like, that's what happens to everybody. And so why should I make a big fuss over the same sad story that everybody else had? I just have to continue on.
Well, and then, it's a very brief scene, but she even sits down a little bit with Spook. And she learns that using tin isn't so much about burning tin and enhancing your senses. It's about filtering out the stuff that
everything else, because it's overstimulation almost, because you could feel everything. I could never reproduce it, but it's really fun to read. That
said, I love the scene where everybody in the crew starts using it. And everybody, or like a few of them are starting to get confused, and then Dachshund chimes in.
He doesn't even say anything.
He just says gibberish, but it sounds exactly like something that Spook would say.
And everybody just busts up laughing.
And Spook says, "Well, you said something, but it didn't make any sense." And so, I love it.
It's really hard to get dialogue really well
to make it feel
and everything
genuine. Yeah. Yep.
Which is a very masculine kind of conversation.
There's an affirmative grunt and there's a disdainful grunt.
Yeah.
And that's really all you need from Clubs, because he's gruff, he's there, he has an opinion, he expresses it. That's all he feels he needs to do. The other thing about Clubs that I find interesting, again, you were talking about how he sort of disappears. He doesn't say anything, he sort of fades into the background. Well, what's his job?
To make them disappear.
He's a smoker. He makes the crowd, or the crew, disappear. He makes them invisible.
It would make sense for him to be focused on making them invisible and not making a lot of noise or whatever else too.
His job is all about not being noticed, and so he's there, but he's sort of in the background. That's sort of his thing.
One random thing that I thought of a little bit ago when you guys were talking about the Lens group versus the Kelsier's group, the crew. Anyway, with the Lens group, there was one scene that I really liked where he's escaping the attempted assassination, and this is after he's found out that Vin is not who she says she's not actually Valette, and it finally clicks to him that he's like, oh, she must be a thief, and he gets all excited about it because he's like, she's not involved in the house party, the politics.
She's not a traitor, she's just a thief. She just wants money.
And his friend is like, what's wrong with you? This should not be a positive thing. But anyway, I just love that scene where it's like his priorities are all sorts of weird.
Well, it's because she's not trying to use him; she's just trying to rob him.
She's just got a thing that she has to do, and just bumped into him.
Yeah, no, I love that. The other thing, you've mentioned a couple times Ellen's group with his buddies. I was mentioning the comparisons to Les Miserables. Again, Ellen sort of fills the Marius role in.
See, I haven't seen it. I haven't read it. I've heard the songs, but it's a big book.
I'm surrounded by Philistines.
I'm sorry. I'm just not a musical person. I like songs. I just don't like music.
For anyone who's listening, I'm making a fun comparison. Mistborn, Les Miserables, Les Miserables. It's a thing. Look for it.
Who do we forget? Yeah.
Or Renew. There wasn't much there, but he introduces something very interesting and important to the world.
And we skipped Ham too. Yeah. We summarized Ham really shortly. We didn't talk much about him either.
Okay, so Ham. One of my favorite things about Ham is he is essentially, if you read TV tropes, if not, it's a dangerous place. There, you'll get sucked in and never come out. But if you read it, there is a trope called Those Two Guys, and he fills that trope alongside Breeze wonderfully. Breeze
I probably know it, but go ahead.
It's essentially there's two guys. They're often paired up together. They're just buddies. They talk about stuff, and they're just, for some reason, they work together. And that's Ham and Breeze to me. It's a very good way of disguising an info dump, because sometimes
it doesn't feel like it. It doesn't feel like an info dump.
Sometimes in a book, an info dump is absolutely necessary. But if it feels too much like an info dump, people get taken out of the story.
And your eyes glaze over and you're like, just got to read this and get the info and move on.
Even though Ham is an Allomancer, he's sort of the everyman in the crew.
Yeah. Him and Yedden a little bit. I think it said that somebody else might have a family. but it wasn't confirmed. Yedin might,
Yedin did have a family. And then Clubs clearly has some sort of a family, not necessarily a spouse, but
An extended family.
Yeah, he has a nephew in Spook.
Mhm.
So I'm not going to call him Lestiborn. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. I think of him as Spook too.
That brings up another interesting scene that I really liked was when Ham was sent to go to the garrison, and he said, "I am not." He said, "I am not going to fight men who think that I am their ally." And it was a very, he said to Kelsier, I'm not going to fight against us, but if you expect me to turn on them and kill these men who I have earned their trust, I'm not going to do it. And it was just a really interesting look because, again, Ham is sort of an everyman. He knows people as people.
Mm-hmm.
And, these, to him, this isn't, traitors who have joined the garrison against the Ska. These are desperate men who need to feed their families.
Yep.
I think it was Susan. I think you're right. Speaking of which, actually, let's look into Allomancy. So each of the books in the Mistborn trilogy sort of focus on one of 3 different magic systems that Brandon introduces across the course of the series. This one focuses, and so we're going to talk about each of those more as they
show up,
are features. So when we talk about Well of Ascension, we'll talk about Farrakami, and when we talk about Hero of Ages, we'll talk about that other one that
we don't know the name of yet.
Just makes me shudder. Yeah. So, who one of you give us a basic rundown of what the 8 elementic metals are?
No. Do you want me to try? Okay. I always get them screwed up in my head, but I've got
the 8 basic ones.
So I have the list, so I'm going to be looking in a direction.
Okay, anyway. That's fine.
So there's pewter, and they're called thugs or strong arms, or what is that?
Pewter arms or thugs.
Pewter arms or thugs, and that is where you enhance your strength. And Abraham mentioned that it was better to not use it all the time, and so you can use it at precise moments, which I know is something with some martial arts as well, is to use the other person's strength against them. But this one, it's using it at the right time.
Actually, I realized I jumped ahead a little bit. Let's do a brief, what exactly is Allomancy? How does it work?
Is Allomancy. So Allomancy, you have the affinity to use it because you have nobleman blood somewhere along the line, and you swallow metals and some liquid of some sort to help get it down, and you burn it in your stomach or whatever, and it gives you metabolize it, and they call it burn. And you are given different abilities. You either have one ability which makes you a misting of one of the different 8 metals, or you are a Mistborn and you have them all. Mm-hmm. So that's the generic view.
Okay.
So do you want me to go over the other ones then?
So yeah, we've done pewter.
Okay, so we did pewter. There's tin, which is what Spook has, and that gives you enhanced senses, but it also has the downside of everything's enhanced. So if you're sitting or you're touching a table, you're going to feel all the wood grain, and everything is super distracting, and noise is really bad, and whatever else that way. And then there's steel. These are the 2 that I always get flipped. Which is pushing metals. So you push metals. I don't know how else to describe that.
Essentially, first off, you get an inherent ability to sense where all the metals
You get blue lines that you can kind of see where they are.
And then you just sort of push away. So
that's the one that they do a lot of jumping with, right? You push something down to the ground and it pushes you up because it counterbalances with the height. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we've talked about the Brandon's, the Sanderson's first laws, and I think the second law is what you can't do is more interesting than what you can do.
Mm-hmm. Zinc and brass, and that's where you soothe or you riot their emotions, where you're making it so they're calmer and more easygoing about things, or they're just angry and incensed about everything.
You're stifling emotions, or you're
amping them up.
Yeah,
because it's easier to get people angry, but it's harder to get them to calm down if they are already angry, or really feeling something.
Everything except for anger. He's okay, he makes it the prominent emotion. Mm-hmm. While with rioting, you make them angry, but they're still feeling everything else they were feeling, and so that takes it off in a whole different direction.
Mhm.
The scene where Breeze is training Vin is just a lot of fun, where he's watching as Kelsier stokes the crowd, and he sends out the girl
The
in
girl with the
different
different colors to say, no, we want that emotion, we want that emotion, we want that. He's totally like a puppet master almost.
Well, because he's got his people. Breeze
Mhm.
isn't just a soother. He's got a team of writers and soothers that he sort of leads.
Mhm.
And they're just sort of interspersed throughout the crowd. And he's a puppet master. Exactly. He knows exactly which string to pull at the right time. He's like, okay, now we want him to be excited, but we don't want him to be too excited. We want him to remember this. He just is playing them.
Mhm.
But he's also like, he's manipulating them, but at the same time, he's not controlling them. And that's why people are able to resist soothing and writing if they recognize that it's happening,
Mhm.
because they're able to logic their way through those emotions that are
That
being
don't make
manipulated.
sense. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, when you know what direction they want you to go, then you're able to start figuring out, why do they want me to go here? What is their angle? And so,
Yeah.
I love it. There's a couple of scenes that I would love to talk about.
Or do we want to finish the medals?
Well, we've technically kind of gone through all the medals. We haven't said anything specifically, but it's come out over the course of the conversation, because we talked about pewter and tin, steel, iron, zinc,
Yeah, I
brass,
mean, we
copper,
kind of talked about the other
we've
ones,
talked
but
about all of them.
I was
Oh, you're talking about
meaning the other medals.
Okay, so there are 4 other medals that show up in the Final Empire.
But one of them I don't think was named. I don't remember aluminum being named.
It was not named. Okay, so the main one, of course, that gets a lot of screen time and is pretty freaking awesome is adium. Now, Jordan, what can you tell us about what adium does? We'll talk a little bit later about what adium is in a different book, but what does adium do? Okay, so adium is awesome. You know that. What about gold?
You see other possible paths for yourself. I can't remember who is it. Does she look at herself with gold first?
Yeah, she sees herself. You can't look at other people with gold.
Oh, that's right.
Gold is for yourself. And she really didn't like the experience.
Oh yeah, it was trippy for her. She did not like it at all.
Well, she saw herself like the other Vin that she could have been, the waif, the scarred child that she could have become. Who you are and who you could have been if things had gone a different way. Yeah, there's a saying that I've heard several times. It's there, but for the grace of God go I. It's like, if things had happened differently, that could be me. And in gold, with burning gold, it literally says, if things had happened differently, this would be you. Gold is internal. Palladium is external.
You see it for somebody else.
So you see where somebody else could have been had they gone a
different choices. Yeah. How to do it.
How to. Yeah.
It gives her the final hint to go, oh, that's how I could do it, maybe.
And okay, we have one last medal that it's not named in this book, but
it gets used on Vin.
Yeah, when Vin is captured, she is force-fed this medal and then told to burn it. And we've learned since that it's aluminum. It burns away all your metals, and that actually becomes very important in later books in Mistborn and in the entire Cosmere. It becomes a really, really big deal. Now, guys, I'm noticing we're starting to get towards the end of the discussion. We've got a lot of stuff to talk about. Should we start to wrap up now, or do we want to look in?
It might be good to do a second video. I mean,
I think we might want to do a second video of this one. We talked about possibly doing that. So, we haven't really discussed the plot. We've looked at the characters and we've been talking about the world. We haven't really talked about what actually happens in the book.
Yeah, we've done little snippets, but not the core of it.
All right. So before we take off, though, I do want to take a look at our favorite world hopper.
Yes.
So where does Hoid show up in this book?
He is an informant for Kelsier.
He is an informant. And so, yeah, so what exactly goes on? How does their encounter take place? Because he gets a little bit more screen time in this one than in a few others,
yeah.
aside from the
Oathbringer?
Stormlight. Yeah, aside from
Yeah.
Stormlight.
I don't remember what information Kelsier was getting. It was like House War stuff, but
He was
otherwise,
he was asking about House Renew. He was trying to see what the
oh, that's
rumors were
right.
saying
About him, about them.
Mhm.
But Hoid's like, oh, well, I can't see very well, but then he passes on some information anyway, and then Kelsier ends up reusing the, my eyes aren't very good when he's pretending to be informant later.
There's like Kelsier's already learning from Hoid, and I love it.
Yep.
Basically, what he does is he reveals to Kelsier, people don't suspect that House Renew is tied to the revolution. Well, that's because that's what Kelsier does. He is the loose cannon that everybody's so terrified of.
Chaos cannot direct chaos. It doesn't work.
Yeah, we were talking about how Breeze is a puppet master. He's got nothing on Hoid.
Oh, yeah.
Hoid's been around for
A
a couple thousand years at this point, at least, because that's pretty much Kelsier.
Yeah.
The other thing I love about Hoid's appearance in this book, there are two things that stood out to me. First off, he uses his name Hoid. He doesn't use that in every book, but in this one he goes by Hoid, and so I kind of see that as Brandon is intending for us to start recognizing this character, because suddenly he's shown up in 2 consecutive books using that name. Why, Brandon? Why is there a character with the same name on 2 different worlds? You make a point of coming up with separate names.
Yeah, unless you're reading like me, you're reading too fast and you're like, random side character, move on.
Yeah, the goal that Brandon talks about when it comes to foreshadowing is surprising yet inevitable. The type of reveal when you get to it and all of a sudden it just sort of blows your mind, and then you look back through the previous book and you think, it's all here. The trail of breadcrumbs was laid, and if I had paid enough attention, I could have found this before. Oh my goodness.
Mm-hmm.
And and he likes to seed his books with stuff like that. I was reading one interview with him where he talks about in Stormlight, Lift has become more and more important over the course of that series. She shows up in the first book in a single interlude.
Yep.
And that's it. That's all we know about her. She, and suddenly you learn, okay, this is interesting. He said, she's going to become much more important later on, but I wanted to seed her early on so that people knew who she was, cared about who she was. And so suddenly when she shows up, she's not this random character. It's just suddenly, oh, hey, this is tying together. And so the other thing I like that I found interesting about this scene is that Hoid is bald. Because
I've forgotten about that.
Hoid is often, whenever you find Hoid, most of the time people say, oh, he's this wiry little guy who has shock white hair. And in this, he has no hair. And so it's just sort of like, okay, so Hoid's a disguise. He likes disguises. And it just sort of sets that up. All of a sudden, they're not the same. And so, all right, well, let's start wrapping up. Before we go, we always want to thank our patrons who support the show at patreon.com/Cosmere Studies. By becoming a patron, you get access to bonus content like the 6-7, a collection of 7 pieces of content we find each week that we all enjoy and we want to share. You also get early access to any bonus shows we produce, automatic entry into any giveaways we have, and more. But more importantly, you help us to build the show. With the help of our patrons, we'll be able to expand the show to record more frequent episodes, and we'll be able to improve the quality of the show with better microphones and other equipment. Now, outside of the Sandersonian Institute of Cosmere Studies, each of us has our own side projects that we like to do. How about you, Amy? Where can we find your stuff?
I'm on Instagram and Facebook and Vero, as well as Twitter, under Coincidence Cosplay or Coincidence Cosp it's too long, on Twitter. I do different cosplay stuff and random pictures and hopefully eventually tutorials once I'm actually good enough at it. But I'm working on lots of different random stuff. So,
what's your current costume? Or is that?
I'm kind of bouncing around between a couple. So I may have I've been invited to join a cosplay group as Toph. So that's kind of cool because I went to the press conference, and that was really awesome. Because people were like, "Oh yeah, I know who you are," and I have the crazy white contacts, and I can see, but it's kind of blurry, just a little bit, and hazy. But that's one of my most comfortable costumes aside from the wig. But
yeah,
I'm just like, it's really comfortable.
I saw that on your feed. That is a pretty awesome costume.
It's awesome.
Definitely check that out on your.
It's really cool.
Is that on Instagram and Twitter or just on Instagram?
I usually cross post, and so I think my Twitter usually ends up being a link to my Instagram, but it should be that way. And I mean, if you look through my Facebook feed, you can find it in my Instagram as well. But I'm also trying to work on, slowly but surely, Nyreen from Mass Effect 3, as well as, oh goodness, I'm thinking about a Nazgul, but I haven't made any progress yet. And I'm going to finish up my Star-Lord. I just have to redo the Greaves and have my husband paint the heat scorching on the guns. And then my Star-Lord will be done. So.
Awesome. And when I'm not here, I'm writing board game reviews over at the Innkeeper's Table at www.innkeeperstable.com. You can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Innkeeper's Table. If you've enjoyed the show and you want to support us, the best thing that you can do for us right now is to go to iTunes and give us a 5-star review. It really does a lot to help us out to find listeners and to grow the Sixer community. In addition to that, be sure to share the podcast and the videos with other Brandon Sanderson fans. Now, before we sign off, do y'all have any final thoughts on just this week on what we've talked about with Mistborn? Anything that you wanted to say that you weren't able to? We'll get more into detail in 2 weeks, of course, but if there's any thoughts that you just hadn't quite expressed it.
It took me talking about it with you guys to realize that my fanfic character, who's a pirate, it's a long story, I think she was kind of inspired by Vin. I'm sort of going, yeah, she went through a lot of the same things. So yeah, I kind of copied that a little bit in my random fanfic. So.
Actually, next week, it might be a cool idea to talk about just actor choices for some of the roles in this, because you're right, this is a very cinematic. All right, well, let's wrap this thing up. In addition to the live episodes of the show that stream on twitch.tv/Innkeeper's-Table every 2 weeks on Monday nights at 8:30 p.m. Mountain Time, listeners can also find our videos on YouTube or the audio version on iTunes by searching for Cosmere Studies. You can follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at Cosmere Studies. If you have any questions about the Cosmere you'd like us to discuss during the show, we would love to talk about any crazy aluminum foil hat theories that you have. If you have any questions or theories or anything that you want to contact us with, you can email us at cosmerestudies@gmail.com. We'll answer questions at the end of each episode, and if your question sparks our interest, there's a chance we might even devote a full episode to the topic. That does it for this week, so on behalf of Amy, Jordan, and myself, thanks for listening, and remember, there's always another secret.